Hello, I'm Alexandra, and I'm a former college professor and a tutor on Wyzant. I help high school students, college students, and graduate students with politics, government, history, writing, and many other subjects. Welcome to Wyzant Under 5, a series featuring tutors like me doing what we do best, helping you learn a lot in a short amount of time. In this video on our 3-part election series, we'll take a look at 5 moments that changed voting in the United States forever. You'll find even more info about all of these in the description. Let's start learning. Women take action. On July 29, 1848, the first women's rights convention in the United States, the Seneca Falls Convention, was held in New York, organized by abolitionists Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Years later, on August 26, 1920, one of the goals of the convention was finally reached. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, giving women the right to vote. The amendment did not guarantee women the right to vote. Instead, laws reserving the ballot only for men became unconstitutional. For decades after the amendment, women would still have to navigate a maze of state laws based on age, race, citizenship, residency, and more that kept them from the polls. After the 19th Amendment, reforms continued. The suffragettes became the League of Women Voters, who introduced the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. Their efforts to ratify the ERA continue today. No one too poor to vote. Imagine that you're finally old enough to vote in your first election, but you can't because you don't have enough money to pay for the privilege. Many southern states adopted a poll tax in the late 1800s in order to restrict freed slaves and other people of color from voting. This meant that even though the 15th Amendment gave former slaves the right to vote, many of them did not have enough money to exercise that right. Poll taxes continued to affect minority communities well into the 20th century. On January 23, 1964, the 24th Amendment was ratified and outlawed these poll taxes. President Lyndon Johnson is credited with stating, "There can be no one too poor to vote. There is no longer a tax on his rights." The Voting Rights Act of 1965. Efforts to end unfair voting policies had been underway for some time by the 1960s. The attack on March 7, 1965 by state troopers on peaceful marchers in Selma, Alabama persuaded President Johnson and Congress to enact voting rights legislation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 forbids states from putting discriminatory restrictions on voting. Today, it protects people of color and non-English speakers from their constitutional right to vote. But a key part of the legislation was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2013. Since then, more than 25 states have enacted voting restrictions, including voter ID laws, registration restrictions, and voter purges. Old enough to fight, old enough to vote. Many of the hundreds of thousands drafted into military service during the Vietnam War were between the ages of 18 and 20 and thus legally prohibited from voting. National tensions were high. The conversation about lowering the voting age in the U.S. had begun decades before. Old enough to fight, old enough to vote was a slogan first heard during World War II, and it was renewed in anti-Vietnam War protests as a rallying cry for those who were opposed to the draft. On June 22, 1970, President Richard Nixon signed the Voting Rights Act of 1970, which lowered the voting age to 18. The 26th Amendment, which did the same, was ratified only a few days later on July 1st. The Americans with Disabilities Act. Voting is one of the most fundamental rights we have as Americans. For a long time, though, Americans with disabilities were excluded because polling places were not accessible. In the United States, 61 million adults live with a disability. July 26, 2020 marked the 30-year anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires that political polling places eliminate barriers for Americans with disabilities, protecting their full and equal opportunity to vote. And there you have it, 5 moments that changed voting in the United States forever. To learn more, click the link above and check out all the other videos on Wyzant Under 5.